Karoline Leavitt claps back at a reporter who twists her words. Watch his face change. The press room was buzzing with energy, the noise of cameras clicking and reporters shouting questions filling the air. It was a political event like so many others, but today, the stakes felt higher. Karoline Leavitt had just finished delivering the speech about the future of the economy and the importance of protecting American values, her voice steady and firm as she laid out her conservative vision for the country. The room quieted as she stepped away from the podium, the microphone still buzzing with the remnants of her speech. It was time for questions, the part of the event where the reporters came to life, eager to catch a politician in a slip of the tongue or a misstep. Karoline knew this routine well. She had done enough interviews to know that not all questions were asked with good intentions. Her gaze swept across the room, her posture straight and confident. The reporters were eager, all hands raised in the air, but her eyes landed on one man in particular, a reporter from a well-known liberal outlet. Ethan Harris, a journalist with a reputation for twisting words to fit a narrative that suited his political leanings. Karoline had dealt with him before, and she knew what kind of tactics he often employed. He had a knack for misquoting and taking statements out of context, hoping to get a sensational headline out of it. Karoline. Ethan called out, raising his hand, his eyes fixed on her with the kind of intense focus that came with years of political reporting. She nodded, acknowledging him, and gestured for him to go ahead. "Thank you for your speech, Karoline," Ethan began, his voice smooth, the air of politeness in his tone only a thin veil over the sharpness of his words. "You mentioned that the government shouldn't be responsible for solving the nation's problems. Are you suggesting that vulnerable populations should fend for themselves without any support from the state?" The room fell silent for a beat as reporters leaned forward, their ears eager to catch her response. Karoline felt the weight of the question, sensing the trap. Ethan's framing was typical. He had taken a part of her speech and twisted it to fit an exaggerated narrative, one that would make her seem cold and uncaring. She took a moment, her expression calm and poised. This was a familiar battle, and she wasn't about to fall into his trap. "I didn't say that, Ethan," Karoline responded evenly, her voice steady. "What I said is that government should not be the sole provider of solutions. People need the freedom and opportunity to solve their own problems. Personal responsibility, self-sufficiency, and community support are key components of a thriving society. The government's role should be to foster an environment where individuals have the opportunity to succeed, not to provide handouts." Ethan's lips curled into a thin smile, but there was a glint in his eyes that betrayed his intentions. He wasn't finished yet. His next question came quickly, almost as if he was expecting her response. "So, to be clear," Ethan pressed, "you're saying that individuals, those struggling with poverty, the elderly, the sick, shouldn't rely on government assistance at all? That they should just figure it out on their own, without help from the state?" The reporters around the room seemed to hold their breath, waiting for her response. Karoline felt the subtle pressure of the room as the question hung in the air. Ethan was trying to paint her as heartless, as someone who would leave vulnerable people to fend for themselves, all for the sake of a headline. It was a classic move, and one Karoline was prepared to counter. She stood up a little straighter, her voice cutting through the tension in the room with absolute clarity. "That's not what I'm saying at all," she replied firmly, her gaze steady as she looked directly at Ethan. "I'm saying that individuals should have the ability to take responsibility for their own futures. The government's role should be in creating a framework for opportunity, not in solving every problem for every person. Helping people doesn't mean making them dependent on the state. It means empowering them to take control of their lives, giving them the tools they need to succeed." Ethan didn't back down. He had heard her words, but he wasn't ready to let go of the narrative he wanted to create. His voice became more pointed, as if he was digging for a deeper trap. "But how can people be empowered if they don't have access to basic resources, like healthcare, education, or housing?" he shot back. "How can you talk about empowerment when so many people are struggling to survive, let alone thrive?" Karoline's jaw tightened just slightly. She could feel the trap he was setting, trying to bait her into a comment that could be taken out of context. But she wouldn't let him. She was too prepared, too aware of the games he was trying to play. "That's why I believe in opportunity, Ethan," she said, her voice unwavering. "Not handouts. When people have the tools to take control of their own lives, when they have access to education, affordable health care, and the freedom to pursue their dreams, that's when they truly become empowered. It's not about relying on the government for every solution. It's about giving people the opportunity to rise above their circumstances." Ethan's face flickered for just a moment, a flash of surprise as he realized Karoline wasn't about to take the bait. But it passed quickly, and he was back to his usual game. But don't you think that's a bit naive?" Ethan countered, pressing further. "You're talking about the ideal situation, but the reality is that people don't have those opportunities. Not everyone can just pull themselves up by their bootstraps." Karoline held his gaze, unshaken, her response ready. "No, it's not naive," she said, her voice firm and steady. "It's the truth. People have more power than they realize, Ethan. And the government's job should be to make sure they have the freedom to exercise that power, not to make them dependent on it." The room was quiet for a moment, the reporters exchanging glances. Karoline had expertly handled Ethan's attempt to twist her words, and now he was the one left fumbling for his next move. His question had failed, and he could feel the eyes of the room on him as the tension shifted. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but Karoline had already turned her attention to the next question. She had made her point, and Ethan, for once, was caught off guard. The room hummed with an awkward energy after Karoline's response. Ethan Harris, the reporter who had hoped to trap her in a controversy, was now visibly scrambling. His usual calm demeanor was starting to crack, and the other reporters in the room could feel the shift. Karoline had not only defended her position, but she had also exposed the flaw in his line of questioning without raising her voice. The next few seconds felt like an eternity for Ethan as he gathered himself. He wasn't going to let her get away so easily. He had a reputation to uphold, and Karoline's eloquence threatened to undermine the narrative he had been preparing all week. With a quick, almost imperceptible breath, Ethan regrouped and leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly as he prepared for his next move. "So, Karoline," he began again, his voice cool but laced with intent. "Let's talk about those tools you believe in so strongly. You say people need the opportunity to rise above their circumstances. But don't you think that for many Americans, those tools are simply out of reach? If you're really advocating for a free market society, don't you also have to acknowledge the systemic barriers that keep certain groups from accessing those very opportunities?" His words hung in the air, almost as if daring her to backpedal. He had taken her concept of opportunity and twisted it further, pushing her into a corner where he hoped she would fall into the trap of ignoring real, tangible barriers like poverty, racism, and unequal access to resources. But Karoline was no stranger to these kinds of questions. She had faced them countless times before. She knew exactly what he was trying to do, bait her into a defensive position where her words could be spun into something that would be easy for the media to criticize. She stood still, her hands folded in front of her, her gaze fixed on Ethan as if she could see right through him. The room was quieter now, every reporter waiting for her response, sensing the building tension. "Ethan, the idea that we need to address systemic barriers is not lost on me," Karoline began, her voice steady, but firm. "But I don't believe the solution is to give up on the entire system. Yes, there are barriers. There always have been. But that's exactly why we need to focus on creating more opportunity, not less. We need to make sure that every American, no matter their background, has access to the tools that will help them succeed, whether that's education, job training, or mentorship." She paused for a moment, her words sinking into the room. The reporters, now fully aware of Ethan's attempt to twist her words, were starting to lean in, eager to see how this exchange would unfold. "And let me be clear," she continued, her voice gaining strength, "I don't think the government should be the one that hands out those tools. Government intervention, while necessary at times, isn't the answer to everything. We need to empower individuals to make decisions about their own futures. The solution isn't creating a society dependent on the state, It's one where people are given the opportunity to rise, to take ownership of their lives and their destinies. The reporters were now looking at Ethan, almost waiting for his next move. He had tried to pin her into a corner, to get her to say something that could be taken out of context. But instead of faltering, Karoline had flipped the script. She had reaffirmed her values and framed the conversation around personal empowerment rather than the victimhood that Ethan was trying to impose. For a moment, Ethan looked like he was searching for something to say, his mind racing for his next attack. But Karoline wasn't done yet. She knew he would push back. He wouldn't let the story slip from his grasp so easily. She could already hear him preparing his next rhetorical strike. And sure enough, he was already gearing up for his next round. "You talk about empowering individuals," he said, his voice now tinged with annoyance. "But you ignore the fact that systemic issues, like racial discrimination, economic inequality, and lack of access to healthcare, are real problems that millions of Americans face every day. How can you claim that people have the freedom to rise above their circumstances when their very circumstances are designed to hold them down?" This time, Karoline didn't hesitate. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing with precision, not with anger, but with the calm confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was saying and exactly what Ethan was trying to do. "Ethan," she said, her voice clear and unyielding, "I'm not ignoring those problems. But what I am saying is that we can't keep telling people that they are helpless. We can't keep reinforcing the narrative that they can't succeed because of the color of their skin, or the neighborhood they were born in, or the money they don't have. Those are real issues, yes. But they're not insurmountable. I believe that with the right tools, the right education, and the right opportunities, people can rise above whatever barriers exist. But we have to stop telling them that they're victims of a system that's designed to keep them down." There it was. The moment when the tide began to turn. Karoline's words hung in the air with a quiet power. The reporters were no longer looking at Ethan for the next question, they were looking at Karoline, now completely focused on her, as though waiting for her to finish dismantling the false narrative that had been so carefully constructed around her. Ethan's face shifted for just a moment. His confident smirk faltered, his brow furrowing slightly. He had expected her to stutter, to backtrack. He had expected her to slip up. Instead, she had expertly diffused every accusation, countering with clarity and precision. And now, the face of the reporter, the man who had tried to twist her words, was changing. His bravado was gone, replaced by uncertainty. Karoline, sensing the moment, allowed a small, confident smile to play across her face. She had not only defended herself, she had redefined the conversation entirely. Ethan had failed. And in that moment, it was clear who had won this exchange. Ethan Harris was beginning to realize he had miscalculated. The reporters around him were shifting uncomfortably, sensing that Karoline had not only deflected his attacks, but had turned the conversation in her favor. For a moment, he remained silent, staring at her, his thoughts racing to figure out how to regain control. He had planned for this. He had imagined this moment going differently. He thought she would crumble, give a defensive answer, and provide him with the headline he needed. But Karoline Leavitt was not playing by the script. His composure cracked just slightly before he recovered, but Karoline could see it. His eyes, once filled with confidence, now seemed clouded by uncertainty. The slight flicker of hesitation in his demeanor gave her the upper hand. And she wasn't about to let him recover easily. Ethan shifted his weight in his chair, adjusting his microphone, then spoke again, trying to regain some semblance of authority. His voice, however, lacked the bite it once had. "So, you're saying that the system works, despite all the flaws?" Ethan asked, though his tone now lacked the usual sharpness. "That's your answer? To simply trust the system and hope things get better?" Karoline's gaze locked with his, unwavering. Her confidence had solidified after his earlier attempts to twist her words, and now, she was ready to deliver the final blow. This wasn't about defending herself anymore, it was about showing Ethan, and everyone in that room, that the narrative he was trying to force on her was not just wrong, but unfair. "No, Ethan, Karoline replied, her voice smooth but firm. I'm not saying we trust the system blindly. I'm saying that the solution isn't to tear down the system, it's to fix it. We can't throw out everything that works just because there are problems. The way forward is not through dependence, it's through opportunity and empowerment. We fix the flaws by giving people the tools to succeed, not by giving them a crutch. Ethan blinked, momentarily caught off guard. He had expected her to stumble under pressure, maybe contradict herself. Instead, she had risen to the occasion with grace and clarity. The room grew still, the other reporters hanging on her words. Karoline wasn't just defending her position anymore, she was challenging the very premise of the debate, and it was clear now who was in control. Opportunity? Ethan asked, his voice softer now, still trying to maintain his combative edge, but clearly struggling. But how can opportunity exist when the playing field isn't level? You're asking people to pick themselves up, but you're ignoring the fact that some people start with nothing, while others are born with every advantage. Karoline's lips pressed into a thin line, and for the first time, she allowed a slight shift in her demeanor, just a touch of empathy, but not weakness. She leaned forward slightly, her tone sharp and resolute. Ethan, I'm not denying that there are inequalities in this country. I've never said that everyone starts at the same point. But what I believe, what I know, is that we can't keep telling people they're incapable of overcoming the challenges they face. We have to stop assuming that their circumstances will define them. I believe that every person deserves the chance to rise, no matter where they start. The silence that followed felt heavy. Ethan opened his mouth, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. For the first time, he realized the futility of his position. His usual tactics, honed over years of media experience, were ineffective against Karoline's calm, resolute defense of her beliefs. And then, Karoline delivered her final blow. Frankly, Ethan, she said, her voice now even, but her words laced with quiet intensity, what I find truly troubling is how often we assume that people can't succeed because of their background. It's like we're telling them, you can't make it because of where you came from, and that's all you'll ever be. That's the real problem in this country. When we stop seeing people as capable individuals and start seeing them as victims of the system, we deny them the chance to prove themselves. The room was still. Every reporter, every person in that press room, was hanging on Karoline's words. Ethan was visibly rattled, his face flushed, his usual quick response now absent. The challenge he had hoped to land had backfired, leaving him speechless, caught in the spotlight of his own failed tactics. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his posture stiff, his hands twitching slightly as he tried to regain his composure. He was on the defensive now, fumbling for something to say, but Karoline had already made her point, and it was clear to everyone in the room that he had been outclassed. Well, I suppose we'll have to agree to disagree on this one, Ethan said, his voice faltering, clearly trying to salvage what little dignity he had left. Karoline simply nodded, offering a polite but firm smile. She wasn't interested in continuing the back and forth. She had already won. It was over. As the tension in the room began to dissipate, the reporters looked between each other, some nodding, others staring at Ethan with a mix of surprise and amusement. Karoline had done more than just defend herself. She had exposed the flaw in the questioning, turned the tables, and left the reporters scrambling for a way out. And with that, the dynamic of the press conference had shifted. The tension in the room was palpable. The immediate aftermath of Karoline's brilliant clapback had left Ethan Harris visibly rattled. He fumbled with his microphone, his face flushed as he tried to regain some semblance of control over the situation. His usual sharpness, once so confident, had been replaced with uncertainty. He looked around, clearly uncomfortable with the fact that the entire press room had witnessed his defeat. But Karoline remained unshaken. Her posture was still poised, her demeanor as composed as ever. She had handled herself flawlessly. While Ethan had tried to trap her with loaded questions, Karoline had turned every attempt into a lesson on empowerment and responsibility. Ethan cleared his throat, trying to reassert himself, but it was obvious that his earlier confidence had been shattered. The room had seen enough. Karoline had won. And the reporters, too, seemed to recognize that this wasn't going to be a back-and-forth battle anymore. Karoline had made her point, and it was crystal clear. "Well," Ethan began, trying to break the silence, his voice a little too high-pitched. "It seems we have differing views on this topic, as always." Karoline didn't immediately respond. She simply nodded, her gaze unwavering, allowing the room to process the fact that Ethan's attempt to manipulate the conversation had failed. She wasn't going to engage in petty banter or a fruitless back and forth. The silence in the room grew longer, thick with unspoken words. The reporters, still absorbing what had just happened, turned their attention to Karoline. Her confidence radiated across the room, and it became clear that she was not only answering questions, but shaping the narrative, controlling the conversation with skill and precision. One of the other reporters, a journalist from a more neutral outlet, decided to step in. Perhaps sensing that Ethan's attempt had not only backfired but left a void in the conversation, he called on Karoline. "Karoline," he asked, his tone more neutral, "many would argue that the barriers you're speaking about aren't just about personal responsibility, but systemic issues that require government intervention. How do you reconcile your belief in opportunity with the fact that many people don't have access to those opportunities because of systemic issues?" Karoline turned to the reporter, and for a brief moment, she smiled softly. This question was different. It wasn't trying to trip her up, it was asking for a deeper dive into her perspective. It was an opportunity to showcase why her views weren't just reactionary, but were grounded in a belief that anyone, given the right conditions, could succeed. Again, Karoline began, her tone steady and even, "I'm not suggesting that systemic issues don't exist. They do. We need to address those problems. But I believe that the way forward is not through more government programs. It's about creating a system where people aren't dependent on handouts, but are given the tools to succeed, tools like education, mentorship, and affordable opportunities. We need to make sure that everyone has the ability to reach their potential, no matter where they start." She paused, letting her words sink in, looking out at the room of reporters. "If we only focus on what people can't do, if we only focus on their limitations, then we're not giving them the tools to overcome those challenges. We need to empower people to take control of their future, not just wait for the government to fix everything." There was a brief pause as Karoline's words took hold in the room. The reporters were nodding, taking mental notes of her calm but deeply thoughtful response. They had witnessed her confront Ethan, and now they were seeing her articulate her beliefs with depth and clarity. She wasn't just reacting, she was shaping the conversation around a vision of personal responsibility and empowerment. Ethan, meanwhile, sat in his seat, looking out of place, as if he didn't know how to respond. He had expected Karoline to be defensive, to falter in the face of tough questions. But instead, she had not only handled his attacks with poise, but had also managed to pivot the conversation toward a discussion about individual empowerment versus government dependence. It was a narrative that he hadn't been prepared for. As Karoline's words settled, the other reporters seemed to warm to her message. The atmosphere in the room shifted again. The reporters who had been waiting for a scandal or a moment of weakness were now seeing Karoline in a different light. This wasn't just a politician pushing an agenda, it was someone who had a vision, who was confident enough in her beliefs to stand up to the media, to stand up to manipulation, and still come out victorious. Ethan's discomfort became palpable, and after a few moments, he attempted to speak again, but the words felt forced. The questions now seemed more like formalities, as if he had already realized that the room had shifted its allegiance. Karoline wasn't just defending herself, she was winning the room over, one calm, composed answer at a time. And then, with a final, graceful nod, Karoline turned to leave the press conference. She had made her point. The reporters were left with no doubt that they had witnessed not just a successful defense of a politician's position, but a masterclass in communication. Karoline Leavitt had turned the tables on a reporter who thought he could trap her, and in the process, she had come out as the clear winner. As she walked off the stage, her confidence radiated, leaving the reporters behind to reflect on the unexpected turn of events. The press conference was over, but the buzz of conversation lingered in the room. The atmosphere had completely shifted. Karoline Leavitt had not only navigated a difficult exchange with a reporter determined to twist her words, but she had turned the entire situation around. It was clear to everyone in the room, she had won, and she had done it with grace and confidence. Ethan Harris, once so sure of himself, sat in the corner of the room, scribbling notes on his notepad, though his expression was one of frustration. The once certain reporter who had tried to corner Karoline now seemed small in the wake of her powerful rebuttal. His hands trembled slightly as he wrote, the truth of his defeat settling over him. The other reporters in the room, while still professional, exchanged subtle glances. It was obvious. Karoline had not only defended herself, but had taken control of the narrative. She had exposed the flaws in Ethan's line of questioning, handled his traps with ease, and articulated her beliefs in a way that commanded respect. And, more importantly, she had done it without ever losing her cool. Karoline was surrounded by a few reporters now, who had eagerly approached her as the press conference wrapped up. The earlier tension had melted into admiration. The questions were no longer antagonistic, they were thoughtful, interested. This was no longer about trying to discredit her. It was about understanding the strength of her position. One reporter, a younger woman who had been quietly watching the exchange, spoke up with a thoughtful expression. "Karoline," she began, her voice respectful, "your response was really something. You didn't just defend your point, you made it clear that your approach isn't about ignoring the issues, it's about empowering people to rise above them. Do you think the public is ready for that message?" Karoline smiled, a slight nod accompanying her response. "I believe so. People are tired of hearing the same old narrative that they can't succeed, that they're victims of a system they can't control. What I'm saying is that we can do better. We can create opportunities, not dependency. And that's a message that resonates with people who are ready to take control of their futures." Another reporter, a middle-aged man with a more cynical look in his eyes, chimed in. "But don't you think there's a risk in pushing personal responsibility too hard, Karoline? For some, it feels like an excuse to ignore real problems. How do you address that concern?" Karoline's eyes flickered briefly, but she was ready. "I'm not pushing personal responsibility to ignore the real problems. I'm saying that we can't keep focusing only on what's wrong. We need to address the systemic issues, yes, but we also need to give people the belief that they can change their circumstances. If we keep telling them they can't, then we're part of the problem." Her words hung in the air, heavy with conviction. The reporters were nodding, some writing furiously in their notebooks, others pausing to let her message sink in. Karoline's composure was undeniable. Every answer she gave was backed by a strong belief in her vision. She wasn't just reacting to the questions, she was setting the terms of the conversation. Meanwhile, Ethan, who had been silently watching the exchange, stood up from his seat, clearly wanting to salvage some pride. He approached Karoline with a forced smile, his demeanor still stiff. "Karoline," he began, his voice still carrying an edge of challenge, "I suppose we've covered a lot of ground here today. It seems you've made your position clear." Karoline turned to him with a calm expression, her smile polite but unyielding. "I've always been clear about my position, Ethan," she said softly, but firmly. "It's just a shame that you had to twist my words to get to this point. But I'm glad we could have a real discussion in the end." Ethan's face flushed slightly, his attempt at a comeback faltering. He opened his mouth as though to say something, but the words never came. He closed his lips instead, his pride wounded. He had been outclassed, not by an opponent's harsh words, but by the sheer clarity and strength of Karoline's convictions. As the press conference wrapped up, Karoline turned to leave the room, her strides confident and steady. The room parted as she walked past, a quiet respect following in her wake. She had done more than just defend herself against a reporter's manipulative questions. She had sent a message. This was someone who could stand her ground, who could face down attempts to undermine her, and who would always rise above it. Outside the conference room, Karoline stood for a moment, breathing in the cool air. The weight of the day was settling on her shoulders, but it didn't feel heavy, it felt like a victory. She had just handled a media assault with ease, and more importantly, she had shown the world exactly what she was capable of. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. As she checked the screen, a message from her team appeared. "You did it." That was brilliant. A satisfied smile spread across her face as she typed back quickly, "Just doing what needs to be done." The fight isn't over. Karoline Leavitt knew that this was only one battle in a long fight. But today, she had proven something important. She could face down the media, defend her principles, and make her case in a way that not only silenced her critics but made them think. Today, she had taken control of the narrative, and she would continue to do so. As the day faded into evening, Karoline walked away from the press conference with her head held high, knowing that this moment would resonate long after the reporters had gone.